May 1945. A warehouse in Newark, New Jersey. Mountains of olive-drab uniforms rise 30 feet high. Steel helmets cascade across concrete floors like metallic waterfalls. M1 Garand rifles, still packed in cosmoline grease, stretch in rows that disappear into darkness. The war is over. 16 million American servicemen are coming home. And suddenly, the United States government has a problem it has never faced before. Imagine standing in that warehouse, the smell of machine oil and canvas, the weight of history in every crate. Millions of tons of military equipment bought with wartime budgets now sitting idle. Too valuable to destroy, too plentiful to store. The War Assets Administration faces an impossible question. What do you do with the leftovers of the largest military mobilization in human history? Within months, a new American institution is born, the Army Surplus Store. Walk into one in 1946 and you could buy a genuine Wehrmacht helmet for $2, a field jacket that crossed the Rhine, canteens that held water in the Pacific. These stores became treasure troves of authentic military history, accessible to anyone with pocket change. But then came 1968, a single piece of legislation that changed everything. The Gun Control Act didn't just regulate firearms, it severed the pipeline that had fed these stores for 2 decades. The surplus stopped flowing, the authenticity disappeared, and an entire business model faced extinction. The war was over, but a new mystery was just beginning. What really happened to the Army surplus stores that sold WW2 gear after 1968 changed all. To understand what was lost, you need to grasp the scale of what existed. At the end of World War II, the United States military had accumulated equipment worth over $100 billion in 1945 currency. Adjust for inflation, and you're looking at nearly $1.7 trillion today. This wasn't just weapons. This was everything. Uniforms for 16 million soldiers, tents for entire armies, medical equipment, radios, vehicles, parachutes, mess kits, boots, blankets, the infrastructure of total war. The War Assets Administration was created specifically to liquidate this mountain of material. Between 1945 and 1949, they sold off military surplus worth billions, but they couldn't sell it all through government channels. Enter the private sector. Army surplus stores, most of them small family operations, became the distribution network for military history. By 1950, there were over 3,000 dedicated military surplus stores operating across the United States. Every city with a population over 50,000 had at least one. They sold everything from genuine Nazi daggers to American paratrooper boots. The inventory was authentic, the prices were low, and for 20 years, business was extraordinary. Then the Gun Control Act of 1968 fundamentally altered how military firearms could be sold to civilians. The cheap pipeline of military surplus weapons dried up almost overnight. For stores that had built their reputation on authentic military collectibles, the question became existential. Adapt or die. The first Army surplus stores opened before the Japanese surrender was even signed. In July 1945, while fighting still raged in the Pacific, a former quartermaster sergeant named Saul Rybak opened a store in Chicago. He had connections. He knew which depots were already liquidating equipment from closed training bases. His first inventory came from Camp Grant in Illinois, shut down as troops shipped overseas. Wool uniforms, leather boots still in boxes, shelter halves that had never seen rain. The business model was elegantly simple. Buy in bulk from military liquidation auctions. Sell retail to civilians starving for affordable goods after years of rationing. A new field jacket cost $40 from a department store in 1945. The same jacket, surplus, cost $6. Maybe it had a cigarette burn. Maybe the previous owner's name was still stenciled inside. But it was real, and it was cheap, and Americans bought everything Rybak could stock. Within 6 months, competitors appeared on every block. Former servicemen, many of them recent veterans, recognized the opportunity. They understood the equipment. They knew the quality. They could authenticate items and tell stories that added value. A helmet wasn't just a helmet when the store owner could explain which division used that particular paint scheme. The War Assets Administration established clear channels. Surplus equipment was graded. Grade A went to other government agencies and foreign allies through military aid. Grade B went to state and local governments. Grade C, the damaged and obsolete material, went to civilian liquidators. This Grade C designation created the foundation of the surplus industry. Walk into a surplus store in 1946, and the inventory told the story of global war. German daggers taken from prisoners, Japanese flags captured on Pacific Islands, American equipment from every theater. The stores became unofficial museums. Veterans came to relive memories, collectors came to preserve history, and civilians came to buy durable goods at Depression-era prices. The authenticity was guaranteed by the source. Everything came directly from military stocks. Nothing was reproduced, nothing was faked. The connection to history was visceral and real. For 22 years, Army surplus stores thrived in an ecosystem that would never exist again. The Korean War created a second wave. By 1950, new equipment was being manufactured for the conflict. Older World War II stocks became officially obsolete. The government liquidated millions of items that were only 5 years old. M1 Garand rifles, the standard infantry weapon of the previous war, suddenly flooded the civilian market through the civilian marksmanship program and direct surplus sales. Here's what made this era unique. There were no import restrictions worth mentioning on military collectibles. Foreign weapons captured during World War II could be legally imported and sold with minimal paperwork. A surplus store in 1955 might have German Lugers for $75, Italian Carcano rifles for $15, and Japanese Arisaka rifles for $12. These weren't replicas. These were the actual weapons carried in combat a decade earlier. The stores developed their own culture. Many were family operations. The Kaufman Brothers store in Manhattan, opened in 1947, became famous for having Wehrmacht uniforms hanging alongside American ones. The owner, a Jewish veteran who had fought in Europe, saw no contradiction. These were historical artifacts now. The war was over. The items were tools for understanding what had happened. Collectors began to emerge as a distinct customer base. By the late 1950s, military collecting had become a recognized hobby. Magazines like Man at Arms provided market values. Gun shows featured surplus dealers. The stores evolved from simply selling cheap goods to serving a community of historians and enthusiasts. The inventory kept flowing. The Korean War surplus entered the market in the late 1950s. Then early Vietnam War equipment began appearing by the mid-1960s. The stores had become self-sustaining institutions. They bought from government auctions. They traded with each other. They purchased estate collections from deceased veterans. The ecosystem was mature and profitable, but the foundation was about to crack. October 22, 1968. President Lyndon Johnson signs the Gun Control Act into law. The legislation responded to the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. Its primary targets were mail-order gun sales and easy access to firearms for prohibited persons. But buried in the comprehensive regulations was a provision that would devastate the surplus industry: strict import controls on military firearms. Previously, a surplus store could import foreign military weapons with basic licensing. After the Gun Control Act, imported firearms had to meet sporting purposes criteria. Military weapons, by definition, were not designed for sporting purposes. They were designed for war. The cheap pipeline of foreign military surplus dried up immediately. Domestic military surplus faced new regulations too. Federal firearms licenses became mandatory for anyone dealing in firearms. Record-keeping requirements increased dramatically. Each firearm sale required documentation. Background checks, while not yet mandatory for all sales, were coming. The casual nature of military surplus gun sales ended. Consider what this meant for a typical surplus store. Before 1968, firearms might represent 30 to 40% of inventory value. These were high-margin items. A Luger purchased for $50 might sell for $150. Foreign military rifles could be bought by the crate and sold individually for significant profit. After 1968, this entire business line faced regulatory strangulation. Some stores tried to adapt. They increased their federal firearms licensing compliance. They focused on domestic military firearms that were still somewhat accessible. But the variety disappeared. The exotic foreign weapons that had made surplus stores exciting became increasingly rare and expensive. The timing was brutal. By 1968, World War II surplus was already 23 years old. The equipment was aging out of usefulness. Korean War surplus was adequate but less plentiful. Vietnam War equipment was actively in use, so little was reaching civilian markets. The stores needed that import pipeline to maintain inventory diversity. When it closed, many stores faced a reckoning. The surplus stores that survived entered a decade of radical transformation. Some pivoted entirely away from military collectibles. They became outdoor recreation stores, camping equipment, hiking boots, the same durable goods that made military equipment valuable, but without the regulatory complexity. Eastern Mountain Sports, founded as a military surplus store in 1967, completed this transition by 1970. They kept the aesthetic but abandoned the authenticity. Others doubled down on the collectible market. They stopped trying to serve casual buyers looking for cheap goods. Instead, they cultivated serious collectors willing to pay premium prices for increasingly rare items. These stores became more like specialized antique shops. A German helmet that sold for $2 in 1946 might fetch $200 by 1975. The business model shifted from volume to margin. A third category emerged, the reproduction sellers. Companies realized that if authentic military surplus was disappearing, they could manufacture new items styled after military originals. By the mid-1970s, stores were selling military-style jackets and boots that had never seen military service. The connection to history was severed, but the aesthetic remained popular. The true military surplus that did reach stores after 1968 came from different sources. Estate sales from deceased veterans became primary. A collector dies, and his family liquidates the collection through a surplus dealer. This created a secondary market, but the volume was tiny compared to the government liquidation era. Some stores found a new niche in police and security equipment. As law enforcement agencies modernized, they sold off older equipment that was still functional but no longer met current standards. This became a substitute for military surplus serving similar customers with similar price points. The stores also faced competition from a new source, gun shows. By the 1970s, traveling gun shows had become major events. Vendors could set up tables without maintaining permanent storefronts. The overhead was lower. The reach was broader. Many former surplus store owners transitioned to the gun show circuit, becoming nomadic dealers rather than fixed retailers. Real estate pressures accelerated the decline in urban areas. A surplus store in downtown Manhattan paid enormous rent for warehouses full of bulky, low-margin inventory. As cities gentrified through the 1970s and 1980s, these businesses were priced out of their traditional locations. The stores that remained moved to cheaper suburban industrial areas or small towns where rent was manageable. The history of Army surplus stores contains bizarre chapters that rarely appear in official records. In 1972, a surplus store in Cleveland received a shipment of crates marked camping equipment from a European supplier. When opened, the crates contained over 200 German MP40 submachine guns. These had somehow been stockpiled and forgotten in a Belgian warehouse since 1945. The store owner immediately contacted the ATF. The guns were confiscated, but the incident revealed that enormous quantities of war material were still hidden in European storage facilities, occasionally resurfacing decades later. Another forgotten story, the theatrical connection. By the 1970s, film and television productions discovered that surplus stores were treasure troves for period-accurate props. The producers of MASH regularly purchased authentic Korean War equipment from Los Angeles surplus dealers. The store owners became informal historical consultants. A field jacket in a 1975 war movie likely came from a surplus store inventory, not a studio warehouse. This created a secondary revenue stream that kept some stores solvent when traditional retail struggled. Then there's the bunker story. In 1983, a surplus store owner in rural Pennsylvania closed his business after 40 years. When the building was cleaned out for demolition, workers discovered a hidden basement room. Inside were crates of World War II surplus the owner had apparently forgotten or hidden. German helmets, American uniforms, equipment in Cosmoline, Greece, perfectly preserved. The local historical society acquired the collection. The owner had died, so his reasoning for hiding this inventory remained a mystery. But it suggested that more surplus may have been stockpiled privately than anyone realized. The most intriguing pattern involves international networks. Some surplus stores maintained connections with dealers in Europe, South America, and Asia throughout the 1970s and 1980s. These networks traded military collectibles internationally, skirting import regulations through creative paperwork. Items would be declared as antiques or theatrical props or historical samples. The parallel market was small but persistent, supplying serious collectors when official channels closed. By 1980, the classic army surplus store was already a dying breed. The children of store owners who opened shops in the 1940s were now facing retirement. Many had no successors. Sons and daughters pursued college educations and white-collar careers. They had no interest in running businesses with shrinking margins and increasing regulatory complexity. When the original owners died or retired, the stores closed permanently. The inventory itself was aging into true antiques. A WW2 helmet in 1980 was 35 years old. The equipment was no longer functional surplus. It was historical material. The price points changed accordingly. What had been a $2 item in 1946 might be worth $200 in 1985. But the customer base willing to pay those prices was much smaller than the mass market that had supported surplus stores in their prime. Reproductions flooded the market. By the 1990s, you could buy military-style anything without it having military origins. Import companies in Asia manufactured copies of classic military items. These were cheaper than authentic surplus and often better condition since they weren't used. The general public couldn't tell the difference and didn't care. For collectors who valued authenticity, this was devastating. For casual customers, reproductions were preferable. The internet delivered the final blow. Why maintain an expensive physical storefront when you could reach collectors worldwide through online platforms? By 1995, eBay had become the dominant marketplace for military collectibles. A dealer could photograph inventory, list it online, and ship to buyers anywhere. The inefficiency of physical stores became obvious. Rent, utilities, insurance, theft, all eliminated by moving operations online. Some stores attempted hybrid models. They maintained small physical locations for local traffic while doing most business online. But the economics rarely worked. The customers who still visited physical surplus stores were often browsers, not buyers. They wanted to handle items and hear stories, then go home and find better prices online. By 2000, the number of genuine military surplus stores in the United States had dropped below 500. These were mostly located in areas with military bases, serving active duty personnel who needed affordable gear. The historical collecting aspect had migrated almost entirely to online platforms and specialized dealers. A handful of Army surplus stores still operate today, maintaining connections to their original purpose. Kaufmann's Army Navy in Manhattan closed in 2018 after 71 years in business. The final owner, grandson of the founder, gave an interview explaining why. The rent had increased 400% in 10 years. The inventory that once sold quickly now gathered dust. Young people didn't understand what military surplus meant. They wanted new gear from REI, not used equipment from forgotten wars. The store's closing made the New York Times treat it as the end of an era, but some survived by radical adaptation. Sportsman's Guide, which began as a military surplus catalogue operation in 1970, transitioned into a general outdoor retailer. They maintained a military surplus section, but it represented less than 10% of business by 2010. The company stayed alive by abandoning its original identity while keeping the name. Other survivors found niches. Stores near military bases focused on serving active duty personnel who needed affordable boots, uniforms, and field gear. These weren't historical surplus stores. They were practical suppliers for soldiers on limited budgets. The connection to World War II and Korea was severed, but the basic business model, selling military equipment to people who needed it, continued. The most authentic survivors are those that fully transformed into collectible dealers. These operations bear little resemblance to the warehouse-style surplus stores of the 1940s. They're small, specialized shops. The owner is usually a serious collector. Inventory is carefully curated. Prices reflect antique market values, not surplus liquidation prices. They survive because they serve a small but dedicated community of collectors and historians. A few preserved their buildings as time capsules. The Dunlap Surplus Store in St. Louis maintained its original 1948 interior until closing in 2005. Walking inside was like entering a museum. Wooden floors worn smooth by 70 years of foot traffic, steel shelving from the Truman era, even some original inventory tags, yellowed and brittle. When it closed, a local historical society documented everything before the building was demolished for luxury condos. Today, the legacy of Army surplus stores exists primarily in digital archives and collector communities. You can still buy military surplus, but the connection to history is attenuated. Modern military surplus comes from recent conflicts. Desert camouflage from Iraq. Digital camo from Afghanistan. The equipment is newer, but it lacks the historical weight of World War II material. Collectors distinguish between vintage surplus, pre-1970, and modern surplus, post-2000. The emotional resonance is completely different. Museums now acquire items that surplus stores once sold for dollars. A German helmet that cost $2 in 1946 might sell for $800 at auction today. World War II field gear that surplus stores couldn't give away in the 1970s is now carefully preserved in climate-controlled museum storage. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans actively purchases equipment from collector estates, equipment that passed through surplus stores decades ago. The internet has created virtual surplus stores. Forums and websites allow collectors to trade military items globally, but the experience is sterile compared to walking into a physical store. You can't feel the weight of a helmet. You can't smell the canvas of a field pack. You can't hear the owner's story about where an item came from. The tactile connection to history has been replaced by photographs and shipping labels. Some collectors seek out old surplus store photographs and documents. Store catalogues from the 1950s and 1960s are collectibles themselves. They show prices that seem impossible today. A catalogue from 1957 listing German Lugers for $65, Japanese swords for $35, American M1 Garand rifles for $49. These documents prove that the surplus era really happened. That for 20 years you could walk into a store and touch history for pocket change. The stores also changed how Americans related to military history. Before surplus stores, military equipment was remote. It belonged to the government or to veterans. Surplus stores democratized military history. Anyone could own a piece of it. This created the foundation for modern military collecting, historical reenactment, and preservation efforts. The hobby of military collecting, now worth hundreds of millions annually, traces directly to those post-war surplus stores. What really happened to army surplus stores after 1968? They died slowly, then quickly. The Gun Control Act didn't kill them outright. It severed their primary supply line. The stores that sold WW2 gear had built their businesses on a temporary phenomenon, the liquidation of war surplus. Once that supply ended, they had to transform or fade away. Most chose the latter. The transformation wasn't just regulatory, it was generational. The veterans who opened surplus stores in 1946 understood the equipment viscerally. They had used it in combat. They knew its value. Their customers were fellow veterans who shared that understanding. By 1980, that generation was dying. Their children and grandchildren saw military surplus differently, as interesting antiques, not as tools of survival. The economic model collapsed under its own weight. A business built on selling goods for pennies above cost couldn't survive when those goods became valuable collectibles. The transition from volume retail to antique dealing required different skills, different customers, and different overhead. Most stores couldn't make that leap. Today you can visit a modern Army-Navy store. You'll find tactical pants, camping gear, work boots, and military-style jackets. What you won't find is authenticity. The gear isn't surplus. It's newly manufactured merchandise styled to look military. The connection to history is purely aesthetic. The real surplus, the World War II equipment that filled those early stores, has dispersed into museums, private collections, and landfills. Some of it was preserved. Much of it was destroyed. Almost none of it remains in the original surplus store context. Perhaps that's appropriate. The surplus stores themselves were temporary phenomena. They existed because a massive war ended suddenly, leaving enormous quantities of equipment with no purpose. They thrived for 2 decades while that equipment was liquidated. They declined when the supply stopped. They died when the customers stopped caring. But for those 20 years between 1946 and 1968, they were something remarkable. They were democratic museums, accessible to anyone. They were bridges between wartime and peacetime. They were places where history was tangible, affordable, and real. Walk past an empty storefront in any American city. Look for the faded paint that might once have read Army-Navy surplus. Imagine what stood there: crates of helmets, racks of field jackets, bins of canteens and mess kits, a veteran behind the counter ready to tell you where every item came from. That world is gone. The 1968 Gun Control Act accelerated its end, but the end was always coming. The stores were living on borrowed time, sustained by the surplus of a war that couldn't last forever. When the surplus ran out, so did they. What remains is memory. Photographs of stores packed with authentic gear. Stories from collectors who bought their first items for pocket change. Museum displays of equipment that once sold for dollars. And the knowledge that for a brief moment in American history, you could walk into a store and buy a piece of the war that changed everything. The surplus stores are gone, but they taught us something important. History isn't remote. It's tactile, it can be held, worn, and preserved. Those stores, in their chaotic, cluttered way, were doing the work of historians. They kept material culture alive when official institutions weren't interested. Now that work continues in museums, in private collections, in online communities. The tools have changed. The methods have changed. But the purpose remains: to remember, to preserve, to keep alive the physical evidence of what happened. The Army surplus stores that sold WW2 gear after 1968 didn't just fade away. They were casualties of regulatory change, generational shift, and economic transformation. But in their brief existence, they changed how Americans understood military history. They made it personal. They made it real. And in the end, perhaps that's their greatest legacy. Not the stores themselves, but what they represented. The idea that history belongs to everyone, that the tools of war can become instruments of memory, that the artifacts of conflict can teach us about sacrifice, courage, and the cost of freedom. The stores are closed, the inventory is scattered, but the lesson remains. History is worth preserving, even when it's just a helmet in a bin priced at $2 waiting for someone to recognize its value.